Hey, folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host, and we have with us a returning guest, Daniel Greenfield. He's a fellow, Shillman journalism fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. And as you know, hey guys, we've had David Horowitz here many times. He's a great guest of the show. We just love him to death. And so anybody associated with David Horowitz is a friend of ours, and that's exactly how we're going to describe Mr. Daniel Greenfield today. He's the author of several pamphlets, including Muslim Hate Groups on Campus, 10 Reasons to Abolish the United Nations, and Why Israel is the Victim. All those you can get on Amazon.com, Daniel Greenfield, Amazon.com. Today, we're going to talk to Mr. Greenfield about an organization called the Trans Resistance Network. And as I was saying to Mr. Greenfield before we started the recording, I'm a former Marxist. And when I heard that, I was like, well, okay, that harkens me back to the old days. That's the type of organization, name we'd give an organization. But I'm thinking to myself, Trans Resistance Network? What the heck are they resisting? But anyway, Mr. Greenfield, he's going to, and by the way, he's well-respected investigative journalism. He's going to give us some info on the Trans Resistance Network. Thank you, brother. Thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. And this is what the left does. It weaponizes people. It literally turns people into weapons. It tells them that they're oppressed. And the amazing thing about, groups like the Trans Resistance Network, this whole thing, is that you have something that just did not even exist a decade ago, 15 years ago, was not on most people's radar. They create a boom in a particular identity group that they manufacture out of whole cloth. Then they convince these people that they're the victims, that they're oppressed, because of course they're going to be pathologically unhappy. It's not possible for a man to become a woman or a woman to become a man. They want those people to be unhappy. They want to damage them. They want to pump them full of drugs. And then they want to turn them into living weapons, which is what we've seen. We've seen a number of transgender mass shooters. But the suicide rates among this group, the rates of suicidal ideation, are above the 50% mark. So you've got a population where half of that population is thinking about suicide. If you've got a population where half of them are thinking about suicide, it is not very hard to also get them thinking about murder, because that's what a lot of these mass shootings are. They're really suicide attempts, but trying to take as many people as they can with them. So the left's endgame is not about respecting differences. It's about taking whatever differences, whether they're real or invented, and weaponizing them, radicalizing them, turning them into activists and even terrorists. That's what we're seeing here.
And brother, would you, based upon what you just said, would you say that's what happened in Nashville not too long ago when this transgender person went in there and shot 6 people, including 3 children?
Yeah, this is the sort of thing that exactly what they want. They take somebody who was a teenage girl who was somewhat troubled. They pipeline her. They pump her full of drugs. They give her counseling. They turn her against her family, against her parents, against her entire background. They convinced her that she was oppressed all this time, that these people ruined her ability to be happy, to ever have a meaningful life. And then, of course, they turn her loose. And they would very much want her to, be doing political organizing or something. But if she shoots up a church school, that's also very good for them, because either way, their end game, as you know very well, is revolution. And revolution can happen politically, can happen violently. The more violence there is, the more they benefit. The more chaos there is, the more they can promise to fix the problem and say that the reason for all this violence is the oppression inherent in American society. This is what we've seen. Joe Biden declared the Transgender Day of Visibility. We've been told that she was traumatized, she was oppressed, she was the victim. So, violence, domestic terrorism means, of course, that we need to negotiate with the terrorists. And behind the terrorists are the people who are on the left, who are creating this problem, who are enabling this, and who are profiting from it.
And brother, is there an organization called the Trans Resistance Network, or is that just a concept they put out there?
Well, there is an organization that they've invented that functions this way. Now, as you know, a lot of leftist groups are basically interchangeable. There are just a whole lot of the same people operating under different names. They will have, maybe the same 30, 40, 50 people back in the day, and they'd be one day they'd be an environmental protest group, the other day they'd be protesting for a higher minimum wage. And they've gotten much bigger since then, but it's still the same basic principle. This is what the Communist Party used to do back in the day. They'd have the authors for peace and the housewives for peace and the veterans for peace, and it would all be the same basic thing, but they'd be targeting different demographics. So having a transgender resistance network means you're targeting people who, in many cases, are troubled young women who believe that they were born the wrong sex, and they're trying to recruit those people. But the hidden hand beneath all this is still the same left. They just have different facades. And the Transgender Resistance Network is really no different than a lot of the Antifa branches, than a lot of the eco-terrorists, and a lot of the anti-police protesters. You drill down, and it's the same people underneath.
Well, do you think this is something that the FBI has been pretty good about trying to sort of keep their finger on, observing them, investigating them, and maybe even trying to keep them from committing acts of violence? You think the FBI has been doing a good job with that?
I'm very skeptical. If there are people, and there are good people still at the FBI, but if they're doing it, they're keeping it very quiet because they know that the moment they discuss it, the moment that it's out in the open, they're going to be facing political pressure from senators, from Congress members, for that matter, from governors, for going after an oppressed minority group, for targeting them. We've seen this over and over again. Every time the FBI tries monitoring, for example, Muslim terrorists or Black nationalist groups, they're called into the Senate, they're berated, they're threatened. And under the Biden administration, they're going to be answering to the DOJ. And the DOJ at this point is all about the Democrat and the left-wing identity politics. So if the FBI is monitoring these people, it's going to be kept very quiet until maybe a year from now or so. The Washington Post will run a story claiming that the FBI is targeting the suppressed group, and immediately there will be political pressure to end the targeting. I suspect that is how it's going to play out.
So what do you think average folks should do? They just let it happen, just let it fester, let it grow, or are there some specific things we can do?
It starts with the family. Watch over your kids, watch over your grandkids. People don't know how this gets started. Yes, it is very much happening in the schools. They're pushing this in the schools. It's also happening on social media. I've seen ads on TikTok from so-called plastic surgeons targeting teenage girls as young as 14 or 16, promoting the idea of cutting off their breasts, turning them into men. And they're doing this in a very trendy way. There's absolutely no regulation, nothing protecting that. In the past, these plastic surgeons would target young girls for unnecessary plastic surgery, make them insecure about their appearance. This is just the next level, but it has the protection of identity politics. Of course, whenever a state steps in and says, well, wait a minute, you can't do this, immediately the organizations like the Trans Resistance Network and the entire infrastructure of the left immediately goes to war against this. So, the front line is very much the household, it's the family. It's hard, I know, especially with the technological and the cultural gap with your teenagers. But they're targeting girls from a very young age, even 8 or 10-year-olds. It's important to try to be on top of this, to, watch what they're consuming, whether it's in social media, whether it's in popular culture, and, certainly encourage legislators to, stop the grooming of children, stop the pipeline that's doing this to teenage girls, because the Nashville shooting did not have to happen. Female mass shooters are very, very rare. Women who shoot in general are very, very rare. This is a situation where you have a teenage girl who already had psychological problems, who was driven to do this. And it's something that can happen to any of us, unfortunately. We just may not be aware of this. They are coming after your kids, and it's really important to watch over your kids. It's important to watch over the educational system, to keep the stuff out of schools, and to keep the stuff out of your state whenever possible, because they keep calling this gender affirming care. It is not gender affirming care. If somebody is having psychological problems, this enabling those psychological problems just makes them worse. You have to treat the problems. You have to actually get them back to normal. Driving them crazier and crazier, mutilating their bodies, pumping them full of hormones. For example, do you know that pumping women full of testosterone, which is a common means, part of the so-called gender affirming care for women or girls who want to become men, pumping them full of testosterone in studies has been shown to lead to uncontrolled anger. You don't want to disturb people with uncontrolled anger. wandering the streets. It's not a good thing. We already have enough people who are damaged. They're damaging people even worse, and then setting them loose and saying, well, it's the guns. No, it's not the guns, it's drugs.
Right, right. Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host. We're talking today with Daniel Greenfield, an investigative journalist, a well-respected columnist, and he's a Shillman journalism fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He's written a number of great pamphlets, including Muslim hate groups on campus. You can get these and others at Amazon.com. You can also look him up. He has a web page. Go to his web page, Daniel Greenfield, and sign up for his newsletter so that you can keep up to date on what he's doing. Today he's talking to us about the Trans Resistance Network. Brother, I just have a couple more questions for you. You've made some pretty powerful statements there. You know, we've had some ministers say, well, it's all about compassion. We're not being compassionate. They have a high, as you indicated earlier, they have a high suicide rate. So we need to be more compassionate towards them. How might you respond to that?
Well, what is actually compassion? You know, walking down the street, I see people who are sleeping in their own filth. They're overdosing, they're dying on the streets because that was the compassionate thing to do. It's not compassionate to intervene and try to help them. We're supposed to enable a completely destructive lifestyle. Is that compassion? Well, that's not what the Bible says compassion is. The Bible certainly doesn't say that if somebody is in trouble, if somebody is in pain, if somebody is destroying themselves or hurting others, then the compassionate thing is just to keep going and let them hurt themselves. That's not the compassionate thing to do. If you have troubled teenagers, the compassionate thing to do is not to hurt them. It's not to make them worse. It's also not to enable them and just to let them do whatever they want. This idea that permissiveness is compassion is completely backward and it's twisted. There are middle grounds on some things. There's a level of freedom that should be allowed. But, there's a role for parents. There's a role for teachers, for leaders, for ministers, for people who actually can step in and intervene the idea that compassion is just saying, do whatever you want. This is what makes you feel good. Do this. If, taking cocaine makes you feel good, take cocaine. If undergoing unnecessary surgery makes you feel good, undergo unnecessary surgery. That is the opposite of compassion. It's cruelty masquerading as compassion.
Yes. Brother, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, if my father hadn't intervened, to this day, I'd be Batman, who would rarely take baths at night. So fortunately, he lacked compassion and smacked me upside my head a couple of times. Said, boy, you better grow up and get to school. Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin, talking to Daniel Greenfield. He's the author of several great pamphlets. He's a fantastic investigative journalist. Go to Amazon.com and get many of his writings, including Why Israel is the Victim. And today he's talking to us about the Trans Resistance Network. And I guess my last question here is, what are they resisting, brother? I don't understand.
Whatever the left resists. The left resists the existing system in order to be able to take it over. But of course, they invent oppression to be able to resist it. Any state that passes legislation saying that, you can't necessarily mutilate 14-year-olds, pump them full of drugs, castrate them, well, that's oppression. Interfering with anything they want to do is a form of oppression. Of course, they're resisting it. The term resistance, they love the term resisting. It is completely backward, which is what the left is. The left makes black into white, white into black. It flips everything around. The left seizes power in the name of its resistance. It's not resisting, it's attempting to wage a coup. It's attempting to go after anybody who doesn't agree with it and force them to submit. That's, the essence of cancel culture. And yet it claims that it's resisting, that it's a resistance. It is not a resistance movement. The resistance makes it sound like it's the oppressed, like it has no power. And the left always keeps claiming it has no power. It has endless power. It controls most of the country. The non-elected officers are all virtually in the hands of the left. The major corporations in this country are towing the line of the left. The entire educational system is towing the line of the left. The left now is actually exercising control over the military. It's trying to seize control over law enforcement. And these are the people who claim that they're the resistance. They're this oppressed group that is fighting back. They're not the oppressed group. They are the oppressors.
Okay, we're going to conclude with that. Fantastic. Really appreciate this, brother. And I want to say to people again, go to Amazon.com. We've been speaking to Mr. Daniel Greenfield, very well-respected investigative journalist, Shillman Journalism Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. Please go there, buy his pamphlets, and check out his website, and please subscribe to his newsletter. I don't know how often he puts it out, but whenever he puts it out, you need to be reading it. Brother, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.